Welcome back to Chapter 27, Walking into Freedom Land, the Civil Rights Movement from 1941 to 1973. So the emerging civil rights struggle from 1941 to 1957. First, let's get a overall definition understood, which is rights liberalism, is belief that the government must protect people from discrimination. When you look at liberalism, modern liberalism, looks to the government is going to be able to have an overall solution to a problem. So when it comes to rights, the belief that government must protect people from discrimination or protect their rights. Okay, so you need to understand, and that's where the civil rights movement overall and its progression is going to be predicated off of this understanding of what historians and what we're calling rights liberalism. So life under Jim Crow, the Jim Crow laws, as you know, were prevalent in the South. You had poll taxes, literacy tests, white primaries that discouraged African Americans from voting. You would have all white primaries, only whites will vote in them. Literacy tests would be something of the sort of, okay, recite the 11th Amendment to the Constitution word for word. And if you couldn't do that, you must not be literate. I don't know anybody that could do that. I'm sure there's a couple people alive that could. And again, poll taxes, I know I'm going reverse here. Poll taxes is that, you don't pay taxes, so you have to pay a minimum amount or prove you paid something in order to vote. A lot of times those poll taxes will put at a number, understanding that most African Americans could not afford to pay those, particularly in the rural South. Housing in the North was heavily segregated. As you saw in the last chapter with the Levittowns, and with they would not take applications from African American families. The banks would what they call redline and not give favorable decisions on mortgages and loans to black families. The so-called northern white neighborhoods, they wanted to keep those white, and that was a reality. Violence was used to discourage blacks from living in white neighborhoods. Yeah, that and other things just make them feel uncomfortable. I'm going back to housing in the North being heavily segregated in terms of mortgages and that, but also remember white flight. White people left the cities in the 1950s, so actually started in World War II, into the suburbs as automobiles made that possible. And from there, African Americans left the rural areas of the South in particular and moved into the cities. So there was definitely this segregation where cities became more and more black or more and more non-white, and the suburbs were very, very white. So the origins of the civil rights movement. First, Nazi racism was attacked during World War II. Racism, anti-Semitism, kind of anti-everything. It was anti-Catholic in a lot of respects. So the Cold War aided the civil rights movement from the standpoint that the U.S. claimed democracy was better than communism, while African American college students played a large role in the movement in the 1960s. Okay? And TV showed demonstrations and violence against blacks. If you want to go back to the Nazi racism was attacked during World War II, we'll get into, remember the double V program there. Victory against Nazis and victory against Jim Crow and discrimination at home. How can you be fighting a war against racism and anti-Semitism when a lot of the same stuff is going on in certain parts of the United States? So, here we go. The beginnings, the Executive Order 8802, where first A. Philip Randolph, who's on the right here, proposed a march on Washington, where African Americans were not getting a free shot at manufacturing jobs for the war effort. FDR barred discrimination in defense industries. Why? He did not want a civil rights problem when trying to build the weapons necessary to win World War II. Okay. FDR was also he was basically on a fine line. And that fine line is, on the one hand, he did have a lot of sympathies for civil rights for African Americans, but on the other hand, his party was loaded with Southern Democrats. And if he went too strong towards African Americans and civil rights, he would lose that coalition. He'll lose that voting bloc, and it will cause severe political problems, not just for him, but for his whole party and his whole coalition. So understand there's a lot of politics at play here. The Double V campaign, which I already alluded to, were victory over fascism and victory over racism at home. Definitely showed a contrast and got a lot of young African Americans interested in looking at the injustices here in the United States. James Farmer was the founding member of the Congress of Racial Equality, which is going to become a very, very important organization going into the 50s and 60s and 70s and today. They're going to play an instrumental role, particularly in the 60s, and many African American veterans benefited from the GI Bill. So after the war, a lot of African Americans families going to be put to the middle class just with the GI Bill itself. So the whole overall African Americans as a group, as a segment of society, is going to change going into the 1950s. Cold War civil rights, the civil rights in the New Deal coalition. Quote, to secure these rights, unquote, was a government report under Harry Truman's administration that advocated government involvement to ensure equalities for blacks. Then you have Executive Order 9981, desegregated the U.S. military. This was in 1948, and because of that, this is going to cause a split in the Democratic Party for the 1948 election, where Governor J. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina will bolt the party with a bunch of other Southern Democrats known as Dixiecrats, and they're going to form their own party. Thurman's going to win a few states in 48, but as you know, Truman is still going to he wins a kind of solid victory, even though Thurman won a few states in the South. The Korean War was the first war fought with desegregated units. Then you have the States' Rights Democratic Party, or the Dixiecrats, what I just talked about. Southern Democrats led by Thurman, who ran for president in 1948. Okay? Then you have race and anti-communism. Racism in the U.S. aided the Soviet Union in the Cold War. The Soviets would say, hey, look at the Americans, how they treat their African Americans, how they treat their blacks. Sometimes they use it the other way too, and would gin up anti-black images to the Soviets, but for the most part they use that as a criticism. Mexican Americans and Japanese Americans. Mexican Americans face similar discrimination, poll taxes, and poor rundown neighborhoods. Cesar Chavez from the United Farm Workers, UFW. You also have the court case of Mendez versus Westminster in 1947, which segregated Mexican schools were not allowed. A lot of people look at Mendez versus Westminster, which is Westminster, California, which is in Orange County. I know that place because when I first moved to California for the first 3 months, I helped work at my friend's dad's store in Westminster Mall in Westminster, California. The problem was it was an hour and 20-minute drive without traffic from where I moved to. Sometimes it took me 3 hours to get to work. That's a different story for a different day. But Mendez versus Westminster, it seems this case is seen to be the precursor leading up to the landmark Brown versus Board of Education, which we'll see later. Okay, where segregated Mexican schools were not allowed. Well, the argument can be made later on. Well, then how can segregated African American schools be allowed? Just, good question. Going back to Cesar Chavez, the United Farm Workers Union, he is going to become a champion of migrant laborers, those that work in the fields out west, in California in particular, produce, grape growers or pickers, and other produce. You see a picture there at the bottom, right, of young Mexicans working the fields. It might be tomatoes, I'm not too sure, I can't tell. Also, California's alien land law was overturned. That's in your book, which forbade Japanese immigrants from owning land. That's nice, huh? So, you had the California's Alien Land Law, which was overturned, and it forbade Japanese immigrants from owning land. It's nice that was overturned. Fighting for equality before the law. You have Thurgood Marshall was an NAACP lawyer and future justice of the Supreme Court. Lyndon Johnson will appoint him to the Supreme Court in 1967, the first African American to be appointed to the Supreme Court. You have Smith versus Allwright of 1944, where white primaries were unconstitutional. You see the picture of Thurgood Marshall in the middle there. I believe that's after they won Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which we'll get to in a second. You got to understand that these lawyers worked very hard in the NAACP for 16 to 17 years to get to the Brown versus Board of Education decision. They built upon it. They fought, they scraped and fought in federal courts all the way through, fighting against all different kinds of discrimination against African Americans. It was a long, hard fought legal battles that led up to Brown. It just didn't happen out of thin air, guys. So you need to understand that Thurgood Marshall spent his legal career before he became a justice on fighting and working so hard to change the courts and to fight for the Supreme Court eventually to look at the 14th Amendment, equal protection of the laws, to make Plessy versus Ferguson reversed and unconstitutional, to reverse that same whole thought in education, that segregated education cannot be equal. So yeah, he was the lead attorney in Brown versus Board of Education. So here's the overall case. It overturned the idea of separate but equal established by Plessy versus Ferguson. As you remember, Plessy versus Ferguson was about separate but equal accommodations in railroad cars. And the Supreme Court basically, I guess, nullified or made irrelevant the 14th Amendment in particular and the other civil rights laws passed by Congress by saying that separate but equal is okay. And that basically ended all the civil rights laws for former slaves until Brown versus Board of Education, where they're going to reverse that separate but equal, but in a different way, not in railroad cars, but in classrooms. Okay? And what it basically was said is that there's no segregation, being separate is inherently unequal when it comes to education. So it led to resistance by Southerners. And if you look at the pictures that I have here, eventually you're going to see federal troops are going to be escorting students into public schools. Then there's a picture I put on the right that I thought was really interesting. It's showing some of the first segregated classrooms. There was massive resistance. Schools would shut down rather than desegregate. So the resistance in these southern states are going to be substantial. They'll say that the Supreme Court is completely out of its league, that they have no right or jurisdiction over this, where education or state matters. And I tend to agree to a point that education is a state matter, but when it comes to basic rights of individuals, especially the 14th Amendment, with equal protection under the laws, I think that's really, not really thin ice. It's very thin ice. The Southern Manifesto was a I hate saying gentleman, but an agreement where Southern congressmen argued the Supreme Court overstepped its power, and that this Southern Manifesto would say that they would fight and work against this overstep of power by the Supreme Court. And you had the Little Rock Nine. Eisenhower had to use troops to protect 9 black students at Little Rock High School. Once Brown versus Board of Education came through and desegregation was starting to happen, and those orders were coming from the Justice Department and from the feds, you had a lot of these states like Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, so going more in the Deep South, will be resisting this. So eventually, Eisenhower was forced to bring in federal troops. Eisenhower really didn't want to do this, but it came to a point that he understood that he had to do so. So now we're going to get to some other events where television and other things are really going to start getting people to pay attention. So, first of all, going into the whole idea of what leads to the nonviolent disobedience, you need to look at Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a teenage boy, young boy, that was tortured and murdered for allegedly saying "bye, baby" to a white woman in a general store. The boy, in the darkness of night, was abducted, tortured, and murdered. And photos of his mutilated body appeared in Jet magazine. If you look to the right there's the photo. I know it's awful to put in there, but you need to understand this is what woke people up, very much so in the North and other parts in the South, of what has been happening to people. Photos can do a lot to start changing public opinion. And it became very, very clear after the Emmett Till incident that exposing the racism, the torture, the murder, and the abuse of African Americans in Jim Crow South, the best way to expose that is with television. The Montgomery bus boycott on December 1st of 1955, a middle-aged woman, Rosa Parks, refused to give up her bus seat to a white man on a bus, the Montgomery Transit bus system. This was the second time she did this. The first time it was ignored. The second time she was told to move to the back of the bus. She refused, and this is the spark that started the Montgomery bus boycott. I don't want you to take anything away from Rosa Parks. Yes, this was done intentionally. Why? Because they know this was happening systematically throughout Montgomery in the bus transit system. And they wanted to bring attention to this and stage this boycott in order to get Montgomery to end this type of discrimination. The leader that emerges in this Montgomery bus boycott is a reverend, a minister in Montgomery at the time, Martin Luther King Jr. He was at the time probably, if you're lucky, 30 years old. Might have been maybe early 30s, late 20s. He is going to emerge as a leader of this, very well spoken and very good at organizing these types of things. He's going to bring forth this idea of nonviolent civil disobedience, which was inspired by Henry David Thoreau in his essay that he read, Civil Disobedience, and Mahatma Gandhi, who used these tactics from Thoreau to liberate India from Britain. Now, if you understand nonviolent civil disobedience, if you look at these two pictures, you see Emmett Till above there, and then below, using these photographs, but then you see down at the bottom right there of African Americans non-violently protesting. See the contrast? You see, when you do this non-violent civil disobedience, it gets your opposition to get angry and turn violent, and you have to sit there and take it. And it shows the injustice. It's a brilliant tactic, and King and his partners in this were able to execute this very, very well. Was it dangerous? Yes. Did people die? Unfortunately, yes. But it was brilliant. It was a brilliant way to finally show America what really was going on in places like Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and other places. It wasn't until November of 1956 this boycott ended, when the Supreme Court ruled segregation unconstitutional, and the Montgomery Transit bus line was pretty much broke. Okay? So it took a long time. And what African Americans would do, they would carpool or walk to work. They would not take the buses until they ended this. And it went on for a long time, and they would get a lot of support. Eventually it worked. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference is going to be founded during this time. And what the SCLC became is the moral and organizational arm of the civil rights movement, especially organizational. King was very good with the network of ministers. Remember, the African American church in the South was the center of civic life for African Americans because they were shut out of politics through the poll tax, through literacy tests, through white primaries. So their civic engagement was with their church. So understand how this was put together. That's why a lot of your leaders still today in the civil rights movement, some of them more than others, a lot of them were reverends, connected one way or another with SCLC and Martin Luther King, like Jesse Jackson. He's not really a leader anymore, but he was a confidant of Martin Luther King. You have Al Sharpton that used to be a leader in New York, not so much anymore, another reverend. Understand that churches are the center of civic life, or were, and still are in a lot of respects, throughout the nation for African American communities. So continuing nonviolent disobedience, the Greensboro sit-ins in February of 1960, known as the Greensboro Four, took seats at a whites-only lunch counter at Woolworth's department store. And in that department store, they would have a lunch counter or a restaurant. Now, these four gentlemen, young college students, came up with the idea the night before. Basically, let's try this. Well, it took hold. And what they would do, more black students will join and would occupy at times 60 of the 66 seats at this lunch counter. And what they would do is they would just sit there, do homework, read a book, chill out, because they wouldn't serve them any food. And Woolworth's argument was that because they were a national chain of department stores, they would adopt the local customs when it came to how they conducted their restaurants. Like in the North, they would not refuse to serve blacks, but they kept it up, and more students were involved, and they kept it up. And so Woolworths eventually would desegregate the counters throughout all their stores, showing that it was very bad for business for them and that they couldn't really do anything about it. When you're nonviolent and you're sitting there not doing anything wrong, it's very, very hard to, resist that and stop that. So it showed that the sit-in is another great form of nonviolent protestation. So a new group is going to be formed, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, S-N-C-C, that's how you pronounce it, SNCC. Facilitated sit-ins throughout the South. About 50,000 people participated in these sit-ins and lunch counters in places throughout the country. 3,600 will be arrested. Because what will happen, they'll sit there and not move. They'll have to call in the police. The police would ask you to move. You wouldn't move, so what they would do is they would arrest you for, disobeying the law or disturbing the peace, whatever those charges would be. So what they had also, SNCC worked to collect money on donations from Northern students, a lot of them white, to raise money for bail, to bail these students out so they could continue to do this and afford to do it. So they'd be bailed out by SNCC getting donations. And that would lead to the Freedom Rides. There's going to be another form of nonviolent civil disobedience. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, I think that's what I remember it's called, organized the Freedom Rides on southern interstate bus lines to expose violations of the Supreme Court rulings. Remember, the Montgomery bus boycott was ended by, they decided to end the transit company decided to end their segregation on their buses because of a Supreme Court ruling that ruled segregation unconstitutional, a violation of the 14th Amendment. So these Freedom Rides were going at the interstate bus lines that were still segregating, forcing blacks to sit in the back of the bus. So black and white students, particularly from the North, college students, in the Freedom Summer of 1961 would go on these buses and these Freedom Rides. Well, the problem was, the Klan is going to reemerge and attacked buses and the people coming off them with clubs and even firebombed some of the buses. So it got violent and it was very, very, let's just say, dangerous. Also, these Freedom Rides with the black and white students, a music movement is going to emerge. It's the folk music movement among college students. Folk music at the time, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and a little bit later after that, not the Freedom Rides, but this whole spirit of fighting for civil rights of Bob Dylan will come during this time. So, but it got violent, it got dangerous to the point that Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy would have to dispatch right there you'll see is spelled wrong. It's not federal marshal to stop the attacks. And the reason they had to do that is that people were getting hurt really bad and even killed on these freedom rides. So the federal marshals would come in to protect the students in particular. Because these buses were on interstate bus lines, the federal government had jurisdiction over that. So, the battle for Birmingham. Eugene Call Me Bull Connor ordered the police to use force against the protesters in Birmingham. They were protesting all kinds of tough things of desegregation in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham was seen to be, like a couple other cities, as, lack of a better term, ground zero of the civil rights movement, where Birmingham was one of the worst when it came to segregation. So the police commissioner, Bull Connor, ordered the police to use force. Well, that isn't going to go over well because these images are going to appear on newspapers and TV. What are the images? Dogs attacking nonviolent people. Groups of nonviolent protesters being fire hosed. If you've ever been fire hosed, I hope you never will. I've never been, thankfully. I've been told that the force is pretty bad. It could fracture bones. It can, I don't know, peel skin back. It's pretty strong force. You can only imagine how brutal that could be. It's painful, depending how far away or how close, the type of damage it can do. But the big thing is that it got on TV. And when people see this in the North and in the Midwest, they're going to realize that there's a big problem here. Martin Luther King is going to write his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. He's going to write it with a pencil and other pieces of paper. And it's really going to get to the heart of his approach and the approach of the civil rights movement, justifying civil disobedience and how it was inspired by Gandhi and by Jesus of Nazareth. It is considered to be one of the better writings, philosophical writings of the 20th century. And it really gets to the heart of the matter of the civil rights movement and why it's being done and how unjust segregation and Jim Crow in the South was. Governor George Wallace of Alabama tried to prevent black students from the University of Alabama. Again, more discrimination in education. There's going to be protests against that, and President Kennedy is going to have to get involved. And basically, Wallace's moves in Alabama is really going to inspire John F. Kennedy to start the process of proposing a civil rights bill to Congress in late '63. But unfortunately, again, his assassination, it would have to be taken by Lyndon Johnson. The March on Washington and the Civil Rights Act coming up in August of 1963. Martin Luther King, one of many speakers, delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which I do have on the whole scores of videos for you to look at in the 60s. There were 250,000 people in attendance, and you can see some photographs there. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 specifically mentioned in this new curriculum that you need to understand, it outlawed discrimination based on race, sex, origin, and religion. And government could cut off money where discrimination occurred. Best way to get states to have to comply, cut off federal funds. Okay? So that's what was tied to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This will be passed after John F. Kennedy is assassinated, replaced by Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson is going to use his legislative skill as the former Senate Majority Leader to get this passed and overcome a very long filibuster in the Senate. He was able to shove through the first Civil Rights Bill of 1957. A lot of people say that's token, but not really. He was able to get Southern senators to vote for that. That was the first crack in the armor. 7 years later, as president, he's going to be able to break a filibuster and get that passed, predominantly with Republican votes, but enough Southern senators will yield on the filibuster to let it go to a final vote. So they would vote against it, but still it would pass the Senate. Freedom Summer, SNCC, CORE, the NAACP, and the SCLC helped registered voters in 1964. This is the Freedom Summer, where they would work to register voters after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party sought to attend the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. They were not put on the floor. They were not recognized. They recognized the whites, and they were left out. Selma and the Voting Rights Act, Bloody Sunday, the attack of marchers from Selma to Montgomery by state troopers. It was the images were not good with Selma and Bloody Sunday. There's a film that's been made called Selma that has to deal specifically with Bloody Sunday. It came out, I think, last year, the year before. It's a good film. And it also became clear that the Civil Rights Act wasn't enough, and what wasn't really addressed in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was voting rights. And there's the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It barred those literacy tests. The federal government could register voters, because if the locals would not register voters, then the federal government could. And then the 24th Amendment to the Constitution will bar poll taxes. That's the only way they could make that stick. They tried it through federal legislation, but courts would overrule it. So the 24th Amendment to the Constitution bans poll taxes. They're illegal. Many Southern whites switched from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. There's a lot of reasons for that, but part of the reason is that they were so angry with the Northern and Midwestern Democrats that they didn't feel they had a home anymore. A lot of the civil rights stuff spilled over to other issues too. So, beyond civil rights, black nationalism, there were many meanings. Pride, separatism, supporting black businesses, etc., were reasons for black nationalism that, the concerns would be about the black community. The Nation of Islam would fall under this category of black nationalism, were popular among African Americans in cities. Malcolm X originally urged violence for self-defense. Eventually, he split from the Nation of Islam and was murdered on February 21st, 1965. Why? Because his views started to soften. He went to Mecca and Medina for the pilgrimage as a Muslim, and when he came back, he was looking for reconciliation between blacks and whites and a more peaceful type of solution to racial problems. And a lot of the Nation of Islam people behind the Elijah Muhammad, and today Louis Farrakhan, who was part of that group that had, as far as reports and history shows, behind the murder of Malcolm X because of his moderation. The Black Power movement, led by Stokely Carmichael, he first emerged as a volunteer and an activist in SNCC. He advocated Black Power as SNCC continued to evolve and became more, you could say, well, Black Power can be looked at as being more forceful. By others were seen to be more radical. He focused on black pride and strengthening black communities, and a lot of the SNCC started to go more to the new left way, more socialist in its outlook in politics and solutions on helping black communities. Also, the Black Panther Party was founded in 1966 by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, urged the arming of African Americans in pursuit of self-defense. They looked at the position of African Americans that if you didn't protect yourself and stick up for yourself, that you will be bullied and abused and subjugated by whites. It was popular in urban areas and focused on community programs such as free breakfast for children, dealing with the intense poverty in African American communities in the cities in particular. The Young Lords were inspired by the Black Panthers and hoped for self-determination for Puerto Ricans in the U.S. and the country. So The Young Lords were for Puerto Ricans. So these different groups, African American civil rights group, will inspire other civil rights groups with other races, like Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans isn't a race, but from a region or identity. They also sought to improve conditions in neighborhood cities, particularly East Harlem, where the vast majority of the Puerto Rican community was larger than the population of the capital, Puerto Rico, San Juan. Also, new urban politics in Gary, Indiana, and Cleveland, Ohio elected black mayors. Just as a footnote, my mother was born in Gary, Indiana, then moved to Cleveland, and then eventually to Los Angeles. So it's kind of interesting. My mother lived in both of those cities when she was a young girl. The National Black Political Convention was held in Gary, Indiana, and toyed with the idea of creating a third party. Eventually, they continued to support the Democrats. There were a lot of African Americans that felt, you know what, the Democrats really aren't helping us. They're taking our votes, but what are they really doing to help poverty and helping the blight in cities and urban issues with African Americans? And but they decided to continue to support the Democrats. They sought national health insurance and the elimination of the death penalty. So some of their issues, actually many of their issues, would be considered to be really liberal or left-wing. Poverty and urban violence. The Watts riots of 1965 was a week-long riot in which 34 people were killed. After more riots in 1967, the Kerner Commission investigated the origins of violence, and what they came to conclude is that our nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Martin Luther King spoke out against the war in Vietnam, while LBJ focused on the war more than poverty and issues at home. So part of the concern is that, you know, LBJ and our government's more concerned about a civil war in Vietnam and worrying about the rights of, you know, the South Vietnamese against the Communist and North Vietnamese. Well, what about the problems that are going on here at home, where you have a separate and unequal of two societies of one black and one white? So MLK started to come to look at, he came out against the war because there wasn't focus being put on civil rights at home. And tragically, on April the 4th of 1968, Martin Luther King will be assassinated by a white supremacist hater, James Earl Ray, at a hotel room, right outside of his hotel room in Memphis, Tennessee. He was there to give a speech, and you'll see on the bottom right, there's a photograph of right after Dr. King was shot, and he would die from those wounds. So the rise of the Chicano movement. Cesar Chavez helped create the United Farm Workers, and he led a great pickers strike to bring attention to the plight of Mexican-American workers. And you look at a poster of Cesar Chavez Day. That's a very big day, March 31st, especially out west in California. In 1968, a 28-day hunger strike that Chavez did, and he met with presidential candidate and former Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. He did what he believed he had to do to try to get better working conditions and pay for these migrant workers and those that worked in agriculture. The American Indian movement, they faced the most challenges of any minority group, and that's kind of being nice. They had stunningly high unemployment, poor housing and schools. The Indians of all tribes, AH8, and the American Indian Movement, AIM, used protests to bring attention to their plight. A lot of these reservations were devastated economically, not culturally per se, but mostly economically, and then the infrastructure there was terrible. In 1969, the IAT took over Alcatraz Island as a protest to try to give light to the problems of Native Americans in the United States. Then you have the Trail of Broken Treaties, a protest across the country by many Native American groups to show that, that the Native Americans have not been treated well over the years, and media attention was widespread of various Native takeovers. And they did these takeovers again to raise awareness and to raise the issue of the issues that were problematic in Native American communities. So a quick review: the role of TV in the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement, Executive Order 8802, where FDR desegregated defense industries, the Double V campaign, the Executive Order 9981 by Truman that desegregated the military in 1948, the Dixiecrats and how they bolted the Democratic Party because of desegregation in 1948, Thurgood Marshall and how he was the lead lawyer in Brown versus Board of Education. It was basically a 20-year crusade of legal battles to get to that point. Eventually, he'll become the first African-American Supreme Court justice appointed by Lyndon Johnson, I believe in '67. Then, of course, Brown versus Board of Education, which finally reverses the separate but equal doctrine set in Plessy versus Ferguson. And that's going to get the legal basis of the civil rights movement going, which will lead to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Some things that are in between, you can't forget the events: Emmett Till, Montgomery bus boycott, the Freedom Rides, Greensboro sit-ins, and not particularly in that order, the creation of SNCC, and the different things that were done there, Birmingham, Alabama in particular, the March on Washington, then the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the 24th Amendment that bars the poll tax, the March on Washington, already said that, Black Power, Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, the Kerner Commission and how we have two societies and separate and unequal, and then Chicano movement and Native Americans. Again, if you have any questions on this, please talk to me. Please send me an email and ask questions while we have our single classes on these chapters. Thanks for watching, and until next time.